around the world. How have Islamic scholars and jurists over the centuries engaged with this doctrine? How have they developed it? How have they understood it? And why is it that radical groups around the Muslim world have been attracted to it so much? To help us sort of understand this very complex concept and to place it in its proper historic, religious, and political context, we have Dr. Hashmi here, and we could not have asked for a more seasoned expert on the topic than Dr. Hashmi of Mount Holyoke. Bernie Pelletier, who is Program Director at Critical Connections, will soon introduce Dr. Hashmi. Before he does that, I will quickly give you an overview of how the evening is going to unfold. For the first 45-50 minutes, we're going to have a conversation. Bernie, primarily, and myself as well, will have a conversation with Dr. Hashmi. Following that, we will break up into small groups and have a sort of engage with the concept more deeply amongst each other. And following that, we will reconvene in the larger group and have sort of an open Q&A session. So with that, I'll invite Bernard Pelletier to come and invite Dr. Hashmi.
Folks can hear me. I'll speak from here. If you can, I'll move over there. I'm very pleased to be here this evening and to introduce actually the three of us. And it's going to be a very short and functional review, so you understand the roles that each of us has played. Let me give you a quick review, and it has to be quick because this man's curriculum vitae is 5 pages long with all the things that he's published, so these are the highlights of the highlights. He is Professor of International Relations and the Alumni Foundation Chair at Social Sciences at Mount Holyoke College. He received a BA, an MA, and a PhD from Harvard, so that was a safety school, actually. There's an inexplicable jog where he went to New Jersey, to Princeton, and got a master's there. We don't really understand that chapter of his life. He's published extensively on Islamic ethics, political theory in Islam, topics such as sovereignty, humanitarian intervention, tolerance, civil society, and jihad. His teaching career earned him a Carnegie Scholars Fellowship to study Muslim reaction to international law. And in 2012, he edited a book entitled Just Wars, Holy Wars, and Jihads, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim Encounters and Exchanges. And as Melika said, you couldn't ask for a more perfect background for this evening's conversation. You've got a hint of what Melika is about. She's worked with the Council on Foreign Relations and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She's a graduate of Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. She's been widely published in both the U.S. and Pakistan, and has been, and this is the best, invited as a guest speaker on NPR multiple times. She's a native of Pakistan and is a U.S. citizen. She's married with 2 lovely children, and that's a significant part of her resume for the simple reason that it is looking at her husband and her family and the world outside that drove her to establish Critical Connections. So this is her driving force. Melika and Dr. Hashmi are here this evening because of what they know. I'm here this evening because of what I don't know. I was an actuary, and in my actuarial career I sought to ameliorate financial crises. Now, in my work with Melika as a program director for Critical Connections, I seek to repair and avoid social crises. And that's, I think, what we have today. I'm a non-Muslim who has had the good fortune to make friends with many Muslims. I sought to learn about Islam and to understand how the wonderful people that I know could be connected in any way with the things that I saw on the nightly news. I went to solve that because I like to read, I like to study. I went out on the internet, which we all know to be the source of all truth. And I tried to understand Islam, jihad, struggle. I tried to understand these things. And I managed, and this is not a figure of speech, I managed to actually terrify myself. I came across sites like Jihad Watch, which basically would have me believe that people I thought were my friends were bound by faith to subjugate me, convert me, and worst of all, tax me. So out of this quest to understand, I developed a series of questions which I'm going to pose to an expert, because I would submit to you that going out on your own into the woods that is the internet on Islam is a very dangerous proposition. So we'll be posing questions that I've wanted answers to for a long time.
Do you want to move a bit closer to the mic?
Yes, I
and
do.
I'm going to bring a mic for Dr. Dr. Hashmi as well.
Actually, do you mind if I stand there? I think I prefer to stand.
It's a series of questions, whatever you're more comfortable with.
Because Bernie just gave me the inspiration.
Sure, that's
And does this work?
perfect.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Stand.
Thank you, thank you. Let me just explain myself. I just had an amazingly savory dinner, and if I don't stand, I might very well fall asleep. Even though the questions I know will keep me on my toes, but this way I can at least see all of you as well, so if you don't mind.
So, Dr. Hashmi, it is not possible today to watch the news and not see a mention of the term jihad. We have ISIS, ISIL, Boko Haram, Hamas, and many more. They all claim to wage jihad. People hearing the news would believe that jihad is inherently offensive, intrinsically militaristic. Could you talk about what, in fact, is jihad? What's its true place in Islam?
Well, I'll be happy to address that, but first let me begin by saying a very, very deep felt thank you to both Critical Connections and to the Karuna Center. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you, and good evening to all of you. I've told friends that I've been in this room many, many times, but I've been here over the years when there's been a concert for toddlers. And I could just imagine my children prancing around this room doing their dances during one of these concerts. So obviously we come for a very different reason, and a very important reason as well. So it's often said that in the United States, the word from Hebrew that most Americans most readily recognize is shalom. The word from Arabic that most Americans most readily recognize and think they understand is jihad. So I think there's a great deal of truth to that. There is, of course, constant use of this word in the American media. And what I'd like to do is try to dissect the various meanings that we find in the media and the various meanings to the term. This is indeed a very complex term within the Islamic faith and the Islamic tradition. So if you don't mind, I'd like to begin with a short story. This is my favorite, as I tell my students, this is my favorite jihad story. It dates back to the time of the Persian Gulf War. There was one morning a mother and her daughter who were driving around the warm and very sort of safe-looking streets of Los Angeles. And they happened to pull up, their SUV came up to a red light, and right in front of them was a black BMW, tinted windows, and the license plate caught their attention. Because the license plate, was one of those vanity plates, and on it was the number 4, and then next to it, the word jihad. For jihad. Now, immediately, the daughter got very, very upset. The mother was upset that her daughter was upset, and she was also upset that the state of California could have issued a license plate to someone advocating holy war. It was a very difficult time, as you might remember, back in 1990-91, the Persian Gulf War. So the mother goes back to her home, and she immediately contacts the California RMV. I think they call it DMV. And they're told that the license plate is registered to a Palestinian, so that makes them even more concerned. And the DMV immediately promises that they're going to take action. They're going to revoke this vanity plate because we cannot have in the United States someone advocating holy war. Now, when the notice goes to the owner of this BMW, he, in the true American fashion, he goes to court. He challenges the revocation of his license plate. And as the story unfolded, it became clear that there was really a complete misunderstanding going on. Because as the Palestinian, who turned out to be a quite well-known gynecologist in the LA area, explained, that the license plate was actually belonging to a car that belonged to his son, who was named Jihad. His son was named Jihad. And his son had gotten this car as a college graduation gift. Now, the good doctor explained that the reason why his son was named Jihad was because his wife had spent 2 days in labor giving birth to jihad. So to honor his wife's jihad, far from a holy war, to honor his wife's struggle, they had named their son Jihad, whom they deeply loved. And so, again, in the happy ending, in the typical American story fashion, everyone embraces everyone else, and they say, oh, so sorry for the misunderstanding. If only we had known that jihad had so many different meanings. Well, unfortunately, this story doesn't seem to have gotten much play in the American media because there's still a lot of misconceptions. So, ladies and gentlemen, when you see the word jihad in, let's say in print, in any newspaper in America, what do you usually find right after it in parentheses? To gloss it, or to explain it, or to interpret it.
War.
Holy war, right? Exactly. That's what I've seen. Every time, in the effort of the American media to explain this concept to Americans, you see jihad, quote, or parenthesis, holy war. So, this term immediately evokes various ideas and images in not just the American imagination, but in the Western imagination. Holy war is seen as somehow in contradistinction to the notion of just war. And most of us think we understand what just war means. It's the good kind of war, the legitimate war. And now, in our day and age, with modern sensibilities, holy wars are just not okay. Jihad is a holy war, therefore, somehow or another, it must not be okay. So, Bernie's question prompts me to sort of in outline form, describe to you the multitude of ways that Muslims would understand the term jihad when they see it in print or hear it. First of all, jihad, and I'm sure you've heard this many times, but it bears repeating. The term jihad in Arabic, from which it is derived, it's an Arabic term in its root. Arabic, like Hebrew and Aramaic, is built on 3 consonants. Just about every word in the Arabic vocabulary is built on 3 consonants. And of course, for jihad, it's jahada, J-H-D. So this root literally means to give your utmost to something, to make an effort, to strive, to struggle. And we know that the Arabs, before the rise of Islam, used this term all the time. They used it in their poetry, they used it in their everyday language. For them, it meant simply to struggle to do something. We don't have any references in the pre-Islamic period to jihad being connected in any way with war or anything else. It was simply to make an effort, personal effort. Now, when the Quran began to be revealed, starting in the year roughly 610, as far as we know, it didn't use this term very much in the initial verses. That is, the verses that were revealed to the Prophet Muhammad in the Meccan period, as it's called. The Meccan period of Muhammad's life is the longer of the 2 periods. He lived as a prophet in Mecca for something like 12 and a half or 13 years. He then moved in the year 622 to Medina, and we have the Medinan period, which lasts about 10 years. In the Meccan period, jihad continues to be used in the pre-Islamic sense. That is, it means purely a personal effort, a metaphysical struggle. And usually it means to do the right thing by way of religion. So it became connected with the phrase, fi sabilillah, which is struggle in the way of God. And this is an Islamic innovation, because the pre-Islamic Arabs would not have connected struggle necessarily with religion. So in Islam, it became connected with the struggle to be a good Muslim, to do the right thing as Islam commands it. Now let me emphasize that in this longer period of Muhammad's prophetic life, roughly again 12 and a half years, there is no hint whatsoever in all of the Quranic uses of the term jihad that it in any way refers to war. None whatsoever. In fact, there is very little in the Meccan verses of the Quran that have anything to do with politics. I'll say sometimes that if Muhammad had died or been killed while he was in the Meccan period, then Islam may very well have evolved. This is a big counterfactual, I know. I'm going out on a limb here. But it may very well have evolved along the lines of early Christianity. because there is nothing in the Meccan period that indicates that Muhammad had any political aspirations whatsoever. He may very well have said, as Jesus said apparently in the New Testament, "My kingdom is not of this world." But that changed. And this is where Islam departs from Christianity in a fundamental way, from early Christianity, that is. Because in the year 622, Muhammad migrated with the vast majority of his followers to the nearby town, what later became known as Medina. And in Medina, Muhammad became not just a prophet, but he became indeed a statesman. And now in the Medinan period, we begin to see the use of jihad. It continues to be used to mean purely metaphysical or personal struggle. That aspect of jihad doesn't go away at all. But there's a new sense that comes to be involved in the Medinan period. Jihad is also now used to refer to a very practical kind of struggle. A struggle to create a just political order. As Malaka mentioned, she indicated to her that, in her personal sense of the term jihad, it could mean to resist tyranny, to resist oppression. And certainly that is one interpretation that is added in the Medinan period. Jihad also came to mean struggle to defend the community by force if necessary, that is through war, through combat. And there are a very few number of verses towards the end of the Quranic revelation which could be taken to signal that jihad had come to have an offensive warfare commandment, that is an expansionist type, not just a purely defensive aspect of jihad, but an expansive notion to spread the Islamic faith to those who have not yet received it or become Muslims. These verses obviously are very controversial, and they are the center of a lot of debate and controversy among present-day Muslims. But the reason I mention these verses is because they became the focus for the early Muslim lawyers who developed what came in many centuries later to be known as the Sharia. And again, the Sharia is a term that is used very often and is commonly glossed as Islamic law. It's not technically, in that sense, law, because it could be much more a notion of Islamic spirituality or ethics. All of that is combined with the notion of Sharia. But let's just continue to use the term Islamic law. The lawyers, when they talked about jihad, they talked about it as an expansionist war. So, to summarize, Bernie, jihad continues to this day to have the sense of purely personal struggle. Right after 9/11, I was asked by someone in Washington, D.C., well, if jihad is such a fraught term, why don't Muslims just disavow it? Why don't they just give up jihad? And, that caught me off guard, because I never even thought about that, the possibility of that. So my response was, Muslims can't disavow jihad because it's intrinsic to their spirituality, to their faith. If you give up jihad, you give up being a Muslim, because jihad means to strive and give your all, your utmost, to be a better human being and to be a better Muslim. So it's intrinsic to Islamic spirituality. There is, of course, the other aspect of jihad, which is not purely metaphysical or spiritual, which is very practical. And in the context of war, it could mean a war of self-defense. And in the view of the classical jurists, it also meant a war to expand the frontiers of Islam. Now, I need to emphasize, it never meant a war to convert unbelievers to Islam, because there is a very clear Quranic prohibition that you cannot forcibly convert people to any religion, let alone to Islam. The verse is 256 in the Quran, and it couldn't be any clearer. La ikraha fid din, let there be no compulsion in religion. And if you continue reading the verses that come right after that, you realize what the Quran is saying is, we, that is God, we have given human beings the truth. It is now up to them to accept it or not to accept it. No one can compel you to accept faith. That is itself a contradiction in terms. You cannot ever compel faith. So, what are we left with today? We are left with a wide-ranging controversy among Muslims themselves about how jihad is to be understood. We have among Muslims today, especially prominent among Islamic mystics or those who emphasize the spiritual side of Islam, they often are referred to as Sufis. We have in Sufism the emphasis on jihad as purely personal, spiritual, metaphysical struggle. And then we have, of course, among the jurists, a debate about whether jihad can be a war of self-defense only, or whether it can be a war of expansion. By and large, I would say the consensus today is converging on the idea that jihad is not a war of expansion of the Islamic State or of Islamic law. It is a war purely of self-defense. But obviously, there are groups within the Islamic world that challenge that. And that's why we are all here, and that's why there is an ongoing controversy about just how should we understand this term jihad.
Doctor, so you've already sort of laid a little bit of groundwork for this, but with all the focus on Islam in the Middle East, it's tempting to think the only religion that talks about armed struggle in religious context is Islam. But in fact, Judeo-Christian traditions have that. It's an immense topic, but is there a way to sort of highlight the comparative things in that?
The just war doctrine as
Yes.
involved.
Well, I left holy war aside because I knew you were going to come to this topic. And so this really is the place to discuss the differences between just war and holy war and jihad. I should say that there is a rich, rich tradition of thinking in Western civilization on what is a just war. Very rich. We have, going back to the time of Cicero, Roman philosopher, and then continuing with the Christian Roman philosopher Augustine of Hippo, and up to the very present moment. And likewise, there is a very, very rich tradition of Muslim thinking about what jihad is. So all I can do at this point is to summarize these very rich traditions. There is a much less developed tradition of thinking about holy war. So let me think with you, and I want to really get what you understand to be the differences. First of all, when you think of a just war, what comes to your mind?
Catholic Church.
The Catholic Church. Why? Who said that? Yes, ma'am. Why the Catholic Church in particular?
Because they talk about it.
They talk about, and a lot of the most prominent theorists of just war have been Catholic theologians, no doubt. But just war today has become secularized in a fundamental way, so that it's a tradition in which both believers and non-believers are contributing to its development. Michael Walzer, Jewish philosopher, is perhaps the most prominent contributor to the just war tradition in our times. His book, Just and Unjust Wars, was published in 1977. It's still a standard in college courses around the country and around the world, indeed, on just war tradition. Just war continues to be developed in a very lively way. There's a lot of thinking about it. There are entire journals devoted to the evolution of the just war tradition. Now, jihad is also a very, very lively and dynamic topic of study. And very few Americans know about this because, again, our media covers a very narrow range of these debates. Jihad has been the subject of disputes, controversies, and indeed consensus, because I think there is a broad consensus of what jihad means in the mainstream Muslim scholarly community. And I'll try to develop that scholarly consensus in a second. So let's leave aside jihad for a moment. But what do you understand by, what are the main tenets of just war? If I could ask it. Can a just war be a religious war, for example? Grounded on religion? No, right? It's become very secularized in that regard. And indeed, just war from its early days, even among devout Christians, was held to be a war that was not fought on religious grounds, certainly not fought to bring people to the Christian faith. So the just war tradition is divided into two basic questions. What is the justice of the war itself? The Latin phrase is jus ad bellum. The grounds for going to war. Do we have just cause for going to war? And today, pretty much the only just cause for going to war accepted by the vast majority of just war theorists is to defend oneself from aggression, defend oneself from attack. This has become enshrined in the UN Charter. That's how powerful this idea is. We don't fight wars nowadays to punish aggressors, although sometimes some theorists would still advocate that. And we don't, certainly we don't fight wars to expand territory or to impose sovereignty. That is just, on its face considered to be an illegitimate cause. Now, there's a second category within just war tradition, which is, do you fight the war properly? Are you fighting the war correctly? This is known in Latin as jus in bello, the just conduct of war. Now, the crucial assumption in just war theory is that jus ad bellum and jus in bello are morally independent questions or criteria. The two cannot be mixed. In other words, you may have the most just cause in the world for going to war, but that still does not absolve you from your obligation to fight with restraint. To fight with restraint. And this was constantly brought up in the recent Gaza conflict because Israel claimed the moral high ground in going to war. They were resisting aggression from Hamas. This was the Israeli claim, and there's some legitimacy to it. There's some legitimacy to that claim. But even if the Israelis have the most moral basis for going to war, they must still fight the war with restraints. And there are two main categories of restraint. The notion of discrimination, that is, you never target civilians, intentionally target civilians with the idea of killing civilians. And the second criterion is the notion of proportionality. Because in any war, civilians will die. And that is known as, we call it collateral damage, but the more technical term is double effect. They're not the intended victims of the war, they're the, sort of the unintended or the consequential losses that are suffered in any kind of military action. But civilian losses must be limited with the notion of proportionality. That is, you use only that amount of military force that's necessary to achieve legitimate military objectives. Obviously, proportionality is a very vague, and many critics say it doesn't really mean anything at all. Because in the heat of battle, in the fog of war, proportionality is the first thing that goes out the window. But nevertheless, it is an important doctrine of the just war tradition. And some international lawyers are beginning to give credence to the idea that you can prosecute armies for war crimes based on a violation of proportionality. So these are first of all, the two main divisions within just war theory, jus ad bellum and jus in bello. And within jus in bello, we have the important notions of discrimination and proportionality. Now, let's talk about holy war. How do you understand holy war? Again, there's not much of a tradition of thinking about holy war. It's one of those things that is just used as a term, but very few people stop or pause to really define it. So I'm just curious, when you see the term holy war, what springs to your mind? Just, tell me what's the first thing. Yes,
Crusades.
Crusades, of course. The Crusades are considered the sort of paradigmatic holy wars. Anything else? In terms of the jus ad bellum, or the just causes question, is there a jus ad bellum in holy war?
Not to my way of thinking.
Not to your way of thinking. Well, it would be some religious motivation, right? God commands it. God commands this war. And of course, in holy war literature, there are three paradigmatic holy wars that are often cited, that are frequently cited. They're the holy wars fought by the Israelites, and they are discussed in the book of Deuteronomy. So to go back to the question Bernie asked, there is, of course, a very rich thinking within the Jewish faith, within Jewish tradition, about just war. And the book of Deuteronomy, if you read Deuteronomy 20, it seems, of course, there is a religious motivation. God commands the Israelites to go to war against the 7 nations who are polluting the land that God has given to the Israelites as their home. So the cause is God's commandment. God's telling you, it's a divine command. God says to the Israelites to go in and cleanse this land. So there is the religious motivation which is paramount in jus ad bellum. Now, can a holy war have restraints in the conduct of a holy war? What comes to your mind? Can a holy war ever be a limited war, in other words?
No.
See, this is, no, you're saying no again. And beg your pardon?
It should be.
It should be. It should be. See, this is what there's a little bit of kind of a lull in answering this because, you think that, yes, if God commands a holy war, then surely a merciful God or a just God would not want us to engage in wanton slaughter. Right? But again, if you look at the book of Deuteronomy, it is pretty much a war of obliteration. And in the Hebrew, it's called the harem, the ban. It's a ban of all non-Jews living in the Holy Land, in the land promised by God to the Israelites. And that idea has kind of moved over into Christian thinking. The Crusades now, we look back at them and say they were an unlimited war. There were some massive atrocities that were committed by the Crusaders, all in the name of Christ. The third paradigmatic case of holy wars are the wars of the Reformation, fought in Europe. And they were a very bloody affair, as you all know. Again, entire population slaughtered in the name of religion. But students of just war say, look, first of all, we don't even know if the Israelites ever waged those wars that are mentioned in the book of Deuteronomy. They may never have taken place. They may all just be much, much later recreations of what the writers of Deuteronomy thought God had commanded the Israelites to do. They may be purely metaphorical, to cleanse the land. Nothing like that ever actually transpired. The Crusades, historians of the Crusades point out that they were fought, actually in many cases with restraint, because there was the chivalric tradition which had already developed in Europe. It was in its infancy, but it had already developed. And the chivalric tradition said, you don't attack innocents. You don't kill people who aren't fighting you. And there are, of course, many examples of the chivalrous knights during the Crusades, but they tend to be forgotten. And then in the wars of the Reformation, yes, they were fought with abandon, but so have many, many other European wars since. And we don't call them religious wars. So let me boil down the discussion of holy war. Beginning in the 1960s, thanks to a very influential book by a writer named Roland Bainton. If you're interested, you should go back and see this. It's a major contribution to the field of holy war thinking, even though he discusses holy war only as an aside. Because the book is called Christian Attitudes Towards War and Peace. He's really concerned about the just war tradition. But what Professor Bainton did in the introduction of his book was to say, look, there's the just war tradition in the West, and there's the holy war tradition as well. They are not the same. They are opposites in many ways. Because in holy war thinking, the jus ad bellum is so exalted, we're doing God's bidding, we're doing God's will, that under the pressure of that exalted jus ad bellum, jus in bello completely collapses. In other words, when you do God's bidding, you don't care how you're fighting. You send the unbeliever to their heavenly reward with as much dispatch as you can. You're not concerned with protecting innocents, saving women and children from direct attack. Jus in bello goes away. So what happens basically in this Bainton framework is that holy war becomes synonymous with total war, with unrestrained war. And it has taken, quite honestly, it has taken enormous effort for just war theorists ever since Roland Bainton popularized this dichotomy to say this is a false dichotomy. That in fact, if you go back and look at just war and holy war thinking in the early period, they did not see any difference really. People who were advocating for just war thought they were also advocating for holy war. But today, we still are very much influenced by Mr. Bainton. So that's why I began by asking, when you see jihad and right after that you see holy war, I dare say that the first thing that pops into many, many people's minds is jihad cannot be a limited war. This is a war of all Muslims against all non-Muslims with the intent of obliterating non-Muslims from the face of the earth. Now, there could be nothing further from the truth. Because what jihad has meant from its very beginning, among the very first verses that discuss jihad as combat or as war, is the verse that says, you can fight against the enemy in self-defense, but do not transgress the limits. This is a direct translation from the Arabic. Do not transgress against the limits, because God does not favor or love the transgressors. Now, the limits here in this verse are rather vague. What's important is that Quranic commentators on this verse, and the lawyers that I talked about, who developed the notion of the physical jihad, or the jihad of combat, the way they understood the words, do not transgress the limits, they understood it as referring to jus in bello, the conduct of war. They may have complete justice on their side in going to war, but that does not absolve any Muslim individual soldier or army of fighting that jihad properly. And what were the limits that they developed? The limits were essentially of discrimination. women, and children can never be the intentional targets of jihad. Many jurists broaden that category of innocents or protected peoples during jihad to include any man who was not directly engaged in the fighting as well. Merchants, for example, or farmers or peasants. And one category that was routinely mentioned is those who withdrew from society and devoted themselves to their prayers and devotions. Obviously, the reference there is to Christian monks who were engaged in solitary kind of meditation, solitude in the deserts of Arabia or anywhere else. They could never be the direct targets of jihad.
Doctor, yes. You brought up several verses, and one of the first things that I found when I went out to try to research this was reference to the verse of the sword. And can you recite it from memory, or I can read it?
Yeah, why don't you read it first?
Yeah, because
Verse 9:5.
Yeah. 9:5. So when the sacred months have passed, kill the polytheists wherever you find them, and capture them, and besiege them, and lie in wait for them at every ambush. But if they repent and perform the prayers and pay the alms, then let them go their way. God is most forgiving and most merciful. That sounds like
Total war, yes. Yeah, thank you. That's absolutely right. And this is one of the two final verses on jihad that I mentioned at the very beginning. The other verse is 9:29. Now, before I continue, I should say that this term, the jihad of this is verse of the sword. That's right, the ayatul sayf in Arabic. That term we don't find really being applied to this verse until well into the 14th century. 14th century of the Common Era. So it was never, from the very beginning, understood as the verse of the sword. The other verse that I should just mention, and maybe you'd like to read that as well, is 9:29.
Yes, sir. Yep.
Why don't we go ahead and talk about them together?
We've got a mind meld here. 9:29.
Use the mic, please.
Yes, I apologize. Fight those who do not believe in God, nor in the last day, nor forbid what God and his messenger have forbidden, nor abide by the religion of truth-giving from among those who have received the scripture, until they pay the due tax, willingly or unwillingly.
Can you read those both again? I'm sorry. Can you hear it very well?
Okay. So the first one, the verse of the sword. When the sacred months have passed, kill the polytheists wherever you find them, and capture them, and besiege them, and lie in wait for them at every ambush. But if they repent and perform the prayers and pay the alms, then let them go their way. God is most forgiving and most merciful. And the second verse, 9:29, these are separate, but the second one, that's the verse of the sword, 9:5. This is 9:29. Fight those who do not believe in God, nor in the last day, nor forbid what God and his messenger have forbidden, nor abide by the religion of the truth from among those who have received the scripture, until they pay the due tax willingly or unwillingly.
Thank you. So, in terms of the development of the classical juristic legal theory of jihad, these verses are all important. The reason they're so important is that we believe they came at the very end of the Quranic revelation. They were perhaps revealed in the last year of the Prophet Muhammad's life. So they seem to be going against the tide of literally hundreds of other verses that came before it, including verses that talk about jihad as purely self-defense, and indeed verses that talk about jihad as having no warlike component at all, that talk of jihad simply as a metaphysical or spiritual struggle. And they also seem to be going against verses like 869, which says, if they incline towards peace, then incline you as well towards peace. That's the famous verse of peace, as it's called. So the jurists had a problem. What was God intending for Muslims to do? You've got seemingly contradictory guidance from God about jihad and about war in particular. So this is the consensus that developed among the great minds of the classical period, by and large. Certainly not all of them subscribe to this view. But the great minds argued that since these verses had come towards the end of the Quranic revelation, they must be the ones that are binding on Muslims evermore. This was the notion of chronological abrogation. The verses that had come before had been abrogated. They weren't expunged from the Quran. You can still read them in the Quran, but their applicability, their relevance to Muslims had been nullified, if you will, annulled by the later verses. And the later verses are pretty much these two. The verse of the sword, 9:5, seems to be commanding an all-out war against the polytheists, whoever they might be. The verse of jizya, as it's called, the verse of the poll tax, 9:29, seems to be an all-out war against, it looks like, if you remember Bernie's reading of the verse, it looks like it's referring to Jews and Christians, those who have been given the book or the revelation before. So, what to do? What to do? Now, certainly, it wasn't a unanimous sort of view that all the earlier verses had been abrogated, but by and large, if you look at the classical literature on the subject, the view was that the verse of the sword alone was a very powerful little verse, because it was said to have abrogated more verses in the Quran than any other verse. 144, according to one jurist counting. 144, that seemed to go completely against the message there. So, first of all, what are modern Muslims doing with this particular issue? Obviously, it's at the heart of the issue. How do we understand the Quran? Yes, ma'am, please go ahead.
Sorry, I'm getting stuck because you said you think that second verse is obviously applying to Christians and Jews, but what I thought I heard him say is it's for people who do not believe in God.
Yes, thank you. You were listening very carefully. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. If you look at that verse and you study it, I've had very close friends, Christians and Jews, tell me, these must be very odd Christians and Jews. Because they don't seem to fit what we understand to be the Christians, even the Christians and Jews of the 7th century when the verse was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad. So, what is the exegesis that we can perform on these verses? Again, we're not going to be simply doing it on our own. This is a topic that consumes a lot of attention today. So one way to understand the verses is, first of all, the verse of the sword. We have to begin there, because that's supposed to abrogate so many other verses. Well, what Bernie did not read were all the verses that come before it. This is verse 9:5, the beginning of the 9th chapter of the Quran. If you read verses 9:1 through 4, it becomes very clear what the context of this particular verse is. And the verses are referring to those pagan Arabs who had fought Muhammad and fought the Muslims continuously from the time that the preaching of Islam began, up to the end of the Prophet's life. Of course, he didn't know that he was about to die at this point when the revelations were happening, but he would die within a year, we believe, of these verses being revealed. These were the most implacable enemies of the Prophet. And in particular, what the verses before 9:5 point out is that they repeatedly make peace with the Muslims, and then, without notice, they renege on their commitments. These people don't honor their words. In other words, they are an implacable foe, and the only way to deal with them is to say to them, and the verse says very clearly before 9:5, 9:4, throw back at them their oaths, or their promises of good faith, because they have obviously violated them. And now 9:5 comes. Wherever you find these oath breakers, fight them, lay in siege for them, until you have finally eliminated the threat. That's the implication. So if you read it in context, one could come away with the understanding that far from being a commandment to engage in a war of all-out obliteration of the polytheists, that this is a very narrowly directed set of verses which talks about those Bedouin tribes that simply could not be accepted at their word, and that would continuously pose a threat to the Muslim community. Now, verse 9:29, again, to go back to that, the words don't really help us much to figure out who the objects are. And they seem to be rather kind of, if you will, a heterodox understanding of Christianity and Judaism. So it very well may be that there were communities that had departed from the mainstream community of Jews and Christians, and that for that reason they may have come into some kind of hostility with not just the Muslims, but also with fellow Jews and Christians. And so the verse is commanding not a war of conversion, again, it's commanding that they be brought under the sovereignty of the Islamic State until they pay the poll tax. Until they pay the poll tax. And this verse then became, in the minds of the classical jurists, the basis for pretty much all relations between Muslims and Christians and Jews. Christians and Jews are treated as people of the book. They're mentioned explicitly as people of the book in the Quran. But in the juridical theory, they became, in a way, subject to the political supremacy of Muslims. They could not be converted by force. Again, the verse is very clear that there be no compulsion in religion. But they could be brought under the political compulsion of Muslims. So the poll tax, in many ways, became a sign of the sovereignty of Muslims over the subjugated communities who were peoples of the book.
That's a fantastic answer.
Well,
This is one of those evenings when there literally is not enough time. Did I interrupt the question?
I think you wanted to follow up on your
Yeah.
point.
Yes.
So a poll tax, so they were then allowed to vote?
No, the poll tax in this case means basically a tax upon each head.
Oh, I see.
Capitation head, yeah, so capitation tax. So it was understood in the legal theory as, now the term Ahlul Kitab means literally people of the book, but they had another term, a technical term within Islamic law. They were known as dhimmis. The Arabic term dhimmi, the media glosses it as second-class citizen. I always find that very humorous because there was no notion of citizenship in that time. There weren't first-class citizens, let alone second-class citizens. So the term dhimmi literally means protected. These were protected communities, protected in the sense of their physical safety was guaranteed by the Islamic State. Now, let me mention that in Muslim history, in the history of the early period, we have examples of Muslim rulers returning the poll tax, the jizya, to any community that they could no longer protect. For example, along what is today the still contested border between Syria and Turkey, in the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, this would have been the contested border between the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Empire. There were some villages in northern Syria which changed hands routinely. The Byzantines would attack, they would take the village back, or the Muslims would counterattack and then they would retake the village. The main thing is that the population remained Christian in these villages. And we have examples of Muslim armies pulling out of these Christian villages, saying to the villagers, we can no longer protect you. And therefore, here is your jizya. We're giving you the jizya back. The money would be returned, and the Muslim armies would vacate. So this is an example, or it's an indication that the jizya was not so much a sign of the humiliation or subservience that peoples of the book were subjected to, so much as it was a tax that was a substitute for the Christians and Jews serving in Muslim armies. If they served in Muslim armies for the common defense, then the jizya was not imposed on them. And we have records of this as well into the Caucasus, in the region today known as Georgia.
I think we'll have time for
Okay,
question
later.
and answers
Sure.
later, but so we'll continue with this
Please.
conversation for another 10 minutes, and
Yeah.
then we'll break up into small groups and then reconvene for the larger.
We have 10 minutes, maybe one last question, and so this is not to put you in any physical danger, but if this is a room full of ISIS upper echelon people, what would you say to them in terms of what's wrong with their theology, or how would you change their theology, or do you agree with them?
Right. Again, it's one of those questions that you wish you never had to answer. As a Muslim, you wish that your fellow Muslims or people who claim to be Muslims knew their faith and observed their faith. So I had the very same conversation back after 9/11 with people who asked about Al-Qaeda. Now we're talking about ISIS. Al-Qaeda has been superseded by yet another group of terrorists acting in the name of Islam. Now the problem for people like me who study jihad as a profession is, we like to engage with other people on the basis of ideas. We could do that with Al-Qaeda. because bin Laden, and especially his second in command, who is now the leader of Al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, they actually wrote a lot. They commented routinely. They had their PR machine working overtime to legitimate their war as a true jihad. So they were quoting chapter and verse. They were saying, we're fighting jihad according to what the classical jurists would have condoned and all that stuff. So we had some kind of, hooks with which to engage with them or respond to them. Even though our own government, that is the US government, told us that that was a futile effort, that we should never do that. That was catering to the terrorists. Well, I believe that it's really important to engage with these groups because their ideology is built on false ground. It's built on a pillar of sand. The problem with the ISIS crew is, with this group, is that they don't have much by way of an ideological justification. They seem to think that what they're doing is self-evidently Islamic and that all Muslims should understand what they're doing is Islamic. But that's, again, as you have heard in the media and from numerous commentators, it is not condoned by what I've been describing as the jihad tradition. Now, if I had to categorize ISIS, I would say they belong to a group that has deep antecedents in the Islamic tradition, of those who believe that they're the only true interpreters of the faith, and that all others are some way or another misguided, willfully or just by their general complacency, and that they have a duty to be the vanguard of the righteous. There was a group during the early centuries called the Khawarij, or the Kharijites, the outsiders. And one faction of the Kharijites did activities, in fact, in the same part of the world, in Iraq, in Mesopotamia, which are very reminiscent of what ISIS is doing today. They were so brutal. Ironically, they targeted fellow Muslims. They left Christians and Jews in Mesopotamia alone because they were protected by the Quran as people of the book. So they went against fellow Muslims because they branded them all as apostates. And what we're finding today is ISIS basically taking that same script from the early centuries and replaying it over and over again. They're not alone by any means in terms of Islamic history. I don't think it would do much good, honestly, to try to reason with them. They don't give us any basis to challenge them because they don't cite any what we would consider Islamic sources. So what I will end by saying is that just as the Kharijites ultimately collapsed under the weight of their own brutality, I think we will see ISIS also fall because they are so far outside of the Islamic tradition that they will gain no supporters. The support that they have up to this point has been a reaction to the many, many failings of the Iraqi government and, of course, the civil war in Syria. But as it becomes clear that these people are not Muslims, they will find themselves isolated and ultimately destroyed.
Talk about leaving on a high note. At this point, I will ask Olivia to come up and take us to the next section of the program.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you. It's such rich material, and I have learned so much, actually, in the last hour. So we wanted to give everybody the opportunity to reflect, to talk to each other based on what you've heard about these long, long traditions of just war and jihad in all their complexity, and thinking about what we're currently seeing in the world around us, whether we think of ISIS, whether we think of calls to war in our own country. What do you make of it all? What are your insights and what are your questions about it? In the room, and if anybody wants to share an insight or a question that came out of the discussion, please feel free to tell us. Yes, and please wait for the mic. And don't be shy.
There's the question of, should some action be taken by somebody against ISIS, or will that just make it worse? should we just let them snuff out by themselves?
Qualify
And-
as a just war.
And maybe before you respond, we could just ask, was there a similar question somewhere else that we could kind of tag with that?
We had basically the same question. You laid out the grounds for a just war. We're no doubt engaging in something like a war. How do we do it?
Obviously, I don't want to be flippant in my response because this is a very serious topic, and we're becoming more and more embroiled by committing our troops to this particular fight. First of all, I need to sort of qualify my comments by saying that I think the Joint Chiefs of Staff have a correct assessment. In my own view, I think they have a correct assessment of the threat that ISIS poses to the United States. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Martin Dempsey, made a long statement recently in which he said, in the assessment of the U.S. government, ISIS does not pose a threat to the U.S. homeland. It does, however, pose a threat to U.S. interests in the Middle East, namely the government that we created in Iraq and are still propping up, and our allies in the Arabian Peninsula and allies in the region in general, including Israel, of course. So ISIS is mainly a group that is targeting what they call the near enemy. This is an old debate. It goes back to before the 9/11 attack, and it was going on in a very heated way. Indeed, it goes back to the 1970s. These groups are relatively small in number, and they're relatively limited in their capabilities. They don't have a whole lot of money. They certainly don't have a whole lot of arms. And they're trying to overthrow entire governments. So as a result of their limited capabilities, they've had to prioritize. Who should they attack? Whom should they go after first? So the argument has been, we need to target the near enemy first and leave the far enemy to a later stage. Who are the near enemy? It's the local governments. And in the minds of ISIS and all the other militant groups that are operating in the entire Muslim world, the Muslim governments are by and large what they would call apostate governments. They claim to be Muslims, but they don't rule according to Islam. They certainly have no goal of creating an Islamic state, as these groups view an Islamic state should look and act. So for them, that's the immediate target. Go after the near enemy. The far enemy should be left alone. The only reason to engage the far enemy is if the far enemy intervenes in the war against the near enemy. And of course, the U.S. has been a target because it is the main prop for a lot of these so-called apostate regimes in the region. But before 9/11, by and large, these groups were content to attack U.S. interests in the region. They knew that an attack on the American homeland would prompt an all-out, full-scale American retaliation. So when the U.S. indeed attacked Afghanistan and overthrew the Taliban government and forced al-Qaeda into the wilderness, the debate became full-blown, and it's not covered at all in our American press, American media. No American really knows about the intra-jihadi debate. People who were opposed to bin Laden and al-Qaeda said, we told you, you were stupid. You brought the wrath of the world's greatest power on yourselves, and look what happened. You lost the Islamic State. You lost the base, namely Taliban-led Afghanistan. Now, where does ISIS fit? ISIS was one of the groups that was telling bin Laden and Zawahiri, we told you. The predecessor was Zarqawi, I'm sure some of you remember, of ISIS. He was one of the most notorious, most brutal of all anti-American operatives during the American invasion of Iraq. But Zarqawi made it very clear to the leaders of al-Qaeda that the main enemy, the enemy worthy of attack, was the near enemy, not the far enemy. Even though the U.S. was operating in Iraq, he still considered the U.S. the far enemy. So he pretty much left the far enemy alone, and he targeted other Iraqis, especially the Shia, who these radical Sunni groups consider to be basically, apostates. So there was an intense debate within this particular community of jihadis, if you will, or Islamists. This is the term that is bandied about, although I'm troubled by the use of these terms. We haven't talked about terms, and we might want to go into that. But basically, Zarqawi was excommunicated by al-Qaeda. You've heard about ISIS being told by Al-Qaeda that they no longer want to be affiliated because they're too brutal even for Al-Qaeda. But that's nothing new. That happened to the predecessor group as well. They were considered too brutal by Al-Qaeda. So all I'm trying to say is that the United States, I think at this point in time, by intervening, is drawing into a conflict that will make it a target. I can imagine now the thinking in ISIS, well, the far enemy has indeed become the near enemy. So maybe bin Laden and Zawahiri were right. Maybe we can't postpone the war against the far enemy to some end times or far distant future. Maybe we need to engage them now. So I think the more that we intervene, the more likely we will see some kind of attempt. And we've already seen that today. I'm sure you've been watching the news. The Australians have intercepted a major plot, they claim, for a terrorist attack on Australian soil. Sydney police, I think they picked up 8, was it? Or I don't remember the number of, there were ISIS-linked militants within Australia. They were allegedly plotting some kind of major action, just to show that ISIS has a global reach. Now, I'm sorry to ramble, but I thought the far enemy and near enemy distinction is important. But ISIS does need to be responded to. And it just cannot be allowed to fester like a sore in the body politic of the region. They are fundamentally opportunists. Al-Qaeda was an opportunistic group. They attacked wherever they thought they could gain some kind of advance to their cause. They always pick weak targets, and so is ISIS. Now, ISIS has benefited tremendously from 2 things. One was the folly of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And let me lay my cards on the table. There were no Islamic or Islamist, Muslim-inspired terrorists operating in Iraq before we went in, because Saddam Hussein made sure that they didn't have safe haven. He was one of the most brutal dictators of the world, of course, as you all know. He had no intention whatsoever of letting his country be the base for any kind of militant Islamist activity. We created a safe haven for Islamists. ISIS developed in the north part of Iraq, and then when the war against Bashar al-Assad broke out in Syria, they found an even more convenient place to engage in their activities, namely the eastern part of Syria, which is currently a no man's land. So that was the second thing that they benefited from. They will continue to develop and fester as long as they're not responded to. But the response has to be both military as well as political and ideological. And in the military response, I really wonder, where are the armies of the Arab states? Yeah. I wondered this during the years leading up to the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Saddam Hussein was a manifest threat to the region. He had invaded his neighbor Iran, led to a most horrendous war, went on for 8 years, caused hundreds of thousands of lives. And then he invaded his neighbor Kuwait. If there wasn't a clear threat to the Arabs themselves, then I don't know what is. They didn't do anything about Saddam Hussein, and now they're not doing very much about ISIS.
Dr. Hatmi, just as a follow-up
Please.
to the response question, we've talked about the political and military response, and you spoke about the intra-jihad debate that's going on.
Right.
But what about a theological response to the ideology? And could you talk about whether there is a sort of consensus among Muslim jurists,
Sure.
contemporary Muslim jurists right now?
I'm glad you asked that. That's a very important question, because one of the failings of Muslims in general and the Arabs in particular with regard to the ISIS threat is that they have consistently failed on a theological or a moral, ethical level to respond to militancy. It's not that I don't think that they're supportive of ISIS. I'm quite honestly puzzled as to why they don't mount a more serious response. We hear from individual scholars that what ISIS is doing is contrary to Islamic teachings, but they don't respond collectively. Now, this is a fundamental problem of, I think, the Muslim ummah, the Muslim community worldwide. There is absolutely nothing by way of a credible, commonly understood or universally accepted authority. The Roman Catholic Church has the Vatican, and the Pope speaks out frequently whenever something like this emerges, demanding his opinion. We have the mainstream churches in the United States, and we have the official established churches in Europe. In other words, there's an authority structure. The world of Islam is devoid of that. And that has created a vacuum for any person to get out there and claim to be a sheikh. Bin Laden he was called a sheikh by the end of his life. Everyone, who supported him was calling him Sheikh Osama bin Laden. He had no formal training in Islam. He was an engineer by education. And yet people were treating his words as if they were inspired by some deep study of the Islamic sources or maybe some inspiration of some sort. So there were attempts after 9/11 to create such an authority structure. There was the famous Amman Declaration that was spearheaded by the Jordanians. But unfortunately, that hasn't really gained much ground. So what we have still is a vacuum of authority. And in this vacuum of authority, anyone can step in and claim to be speaking in the name of Islam. And we don't have really any concerted way to say, no, you are wrong. This is completely antithetical to the teachings of Islam. What we have is sporadic and scattered responses. And that, quite honestly, has failed. So we need to think of another way.
Good question for here. Please comment.
I wondered if the Wahhabi influence in Saudi Arabia had something to do with the tepid response that country has and some of the other countries as well.
Right.
Does anybody else have a related question?
It's a very good question, and again...
Yes, related?
Yeah,
Sort
yes,
of.
Well, my assumption was that many of the Arab states' governments are so corrupt and oppressive, they've got all they can do just to keep people down within their own country. They're not going to be going out and attacking other Muslims.
Well, I can begin by just saying I completely agree with you. The billions of dollars that are spent, hundreds of billions of dollars that have been spent over the past several years on the Arab militaries, they're primarily to make sure the military is able to quash any protests within their own country. So more than anything else, they're instruments of repression rather than instruments of defense or collective action for the Arab peoples. Now, in terms of, what was the Wahhabism, this is, again, it goes back to the situation after 9/11, because the Saudis often were blamed in some ways or another for aiding and abetting the rise of Al-Qaeda. It's a complicated answer because the Saudi state is itself a very complex animal. There are certainly elements in Saudi society which support ISIS's ideology, just as they supported bin Laden and Al-Qaeda's ideology. But that ideology is antithetical to the ruling elites. ISIS sends shivers down the spine of the Saudi royal family, those in power, because ISIS has made it very clear that they consider the Saudi royal house completely antithetical to Islam, and basically they're the near enemy because they're stooges of the West. They do the bidding of the West. They suppress their own people. And most importantly, they claim to be operating on the basis of the Quran. As you know, the Saudi slogan is they don't have a constitution because the Quran is their constitution. Well, the ISIS folks will say, if that's the case, then, how do you explain all the corruption and all the, Saudi Arabia operates, for example, on many things that, including taking bank interests, which is considered to be an antithesis of what Islamic teachings on economics would allow. So these are all grievances for groups like ISIS. And that's why there's this almost a paralysis in Saudi society. The ruling elite certainly, I don't think, have any real reason to support ISIS, but if they take too strong an action against ISIS, they may be seen as traitors to their own people's belief in what is a legitimate movement.
And that's where the Wahhabis might come in, because they're not necessarily part of the ruling elite. But they're
right.
But they're
Exactly. Well, Wahhabism, it's interwoven with the entire structure of Saudi Arabia. There are two ruling elites in Saudi Arabia. One is the Saudi family, descended from Abdulaziz ibn Saud. We have seen a succession of the sons of Abdulaziz taking the throne ever since Abdulaziz died. But we have also a group called the Al-Sheikh, the people of the Sheikh. And the Sheikh here is none other than Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who was the originator of the doctrine of Wahhabism, and he lived in the mid-18th century, the 1700s. So the Saudi royal house has intermarried with the Al-Sheikh for generations, for decades. It's really hard to separate the two. But you're absolutely right. The people who claim to be the defenders of Wahhabism, they really see the Saudi royal house as having gone fundamentally astray. And so for them, the Saudi royal house is a legitimate enemy. And that's why, again, you find these very deep divisions in Saudi society. By the way, I should say, I was in Saudi Arabia not too long ago, in January. And it was before the ISIS threat materialized. But I had a chance to talk to various Saudis about their views on Islamic extremism in general. And I found, by and large, among Saudi intellectuals and Saudi, I wouldn't say the masses by any means, but the Saudi elites, that there is a general feeling that these groups need to be responded to, and that Saudi Arabia needs to take a more active role in response. But again, the timid, tepid response of the Saudi state is always because of the fear that they may be unleashing a can of worms here.
So one here, and then back there, I think, and then
Well, I think we'd all agree this is a time of crisis, and certainly in the Middle East. And the symbol for that, I understand, is also a time of possible opportunity. But do you see any chances of something constructive coming out of all this?
Well, thank you. That's
what a wonderful question.
Yeah. I like to think of myself as an optimist. I was, like a lot of observers of the Middle East, a lot of students of Middle East politics, I was just swept away by the Arab Spring. I was hoping that it would be signal a new era, and in many ways, it has signaled a new era. Unfortunately, we don't hear about these. How many of you saw glaring headlines in the New York Times? The Tunisian Constituent Assembly adopts a new constitution for Tunisia without a shed of any blood at all. Anyone see that kind of headline? Tunisians make peace. You saw that? Well, I certainly didn't notice CNN talking heads dwelling on that. Or recently, Turkey elected its first popularly elected president in its entire history as a republic. Again, without any violence. And the new president happens to be a so-called Islamist. The AKP is a religiously oriented party, although it favors secularism in Turkey. So we don't hear about these things, but there are definitely signs of some continuing change in the region, change for the better. Saudi Arabia even, I see, one thing I will say, I was very impressed in Saudi Arabia by the commitment that I saw at all levels to education. As an educator, I found this very heartwarming. And not only is it education on a technical level, but there's also a feeling that Saudi Arabia needs to develop some liberal arts component to their curriculum. And that they need to really take lessons from the American Academy. That's why I was there, as a humble representative of the American Academy. So there are definitely positive signs.
Education for women?
Including, there is a school that has opened in Jeddah, the port city very close to Mecca. And it was established by the daughter of the late King Faisal. And guess what her model for this girls' college is, women's college? Magnolia. She has spent a lot of time on our campus, and her advisors have spent even more time. And we have sent our administrators over to Jeddah to advise them. So it's really an amazing school. And the best thing about it is that it's a school that has very generous financial aid. So it's not just the daughters of the elite who attend it, but it's daughters who can't afford an education otherwise, that this princess is funding their education. So there are, again, places like Egypt give me pause. It's really tragic the way the Arab Spring has become kind of diverted there into another, Arab fall or winter of dictatorship, because I think that's what we're seeing. But these forces, sometimes they have a long gestation period, and there are always setbacks. I mean, for heaven's sake, how many centuries did it take the United States of America to develop into the perfect republic that we have now? I mean, did we fight a civil war or not? So it takes a long time for democracy to be truly inculcated. But I think the forces have been unleashed, and the younger generation give me hope. We find ISIS constantly grabbing the headlines, because they are a manifest threat at many levels. But they're a very small group, and we keep forgetting that. There are a few thousand at the most. And I think by and large, the peoples of the Middle East and Muslim peoples in general do not follow this ideology. And I think, again, they will collapse, they will implode because of their own manifest departure from Islamic teachings.
Just one clarification. You said a few thousand. I heard 25 to 30,000.
Those figures are, no one really knows the numbers. I've heard from anywhere from 6,000 up to what you're saying. But you have to keep in mind, a lot of these are jihadi adventurers. You know, they're being drawn there for some reason personal to them. You know, they're very deeply dissatisfied with their own lives. I've been in the UK a lot among British Muslims, and tragically, British society has failed to really show how you can be both a Muslim and a British citizen. You know, it's really, I don't know how to describe it in short, but there's a very big difference I noticed between the Muslim population of the United States and the Muslim population of the United Kingdom. The British, not all certainly, the vast majority are assimilated and very, very loyal British citizens, but there is a strong extremist element to the UK British population, British Muslim population. And those are the kinds of figures that are being drawn to Syria. They, you know, psychologists and sociologists have studied the phenomenon of what drives young people to this kind of religious fanaticism and zealotry. And the one factor that they're pointing to over and over again is a sense of humiliation on a very personal level, a feeling of estrangement in their own societies. That somehow they've been degraded, you know, not allowed to feel that they were full members of a society. And I can see that, you know, because I've met some of these people, these very disaffected youth, and I can see them being drawn because I think God commanded them to struggle and to bring down a dictatorship like Bashar al-Assad. They went originally to fight against Bashar al-Assad, then they got diverted to Iraq, and they were told that, of course, you know, the Iraqi government is just as corrupt and just as anti-Islamic as the Syrian government, and so here they are now fighting in Iraq. But again, these are fringe elements. Fringe elements, I think that's important to emphasize, and I think they will remain a fringe element, quite honestly.
And you're so right that we don't hear the positive stories of what's still
I'm so
emerging
glad
from the Arab Spring.
You have to show me that coverage of the Tunisian constitution. That was, I know it was covered in the press, but you know how much play did it get? That's a dramatic milestone.
It wasn't, you know, it was on the cover of the New York Times. It was
I'm
at the
glad to hear
bottom.
that.
It wasn't the banner.
Okay.
It was a little thing at the bottom.
The New York Times, good. You know, I wish more Americans read the New York Times. But you know, just to put it in context, the Tunisian government was and still is led by Islamists. These are, you know, Islamic activists. Rashid Ghannouchi is the leader of the Ennahda party, the Renaissance party, and Ghannouchi was declared a terrorist in the 1990s by our own government, the United States of America. He was declared persona non grata. I heard him speak in 1989. That was the last time he was in the United States. Even though the man has consistently advocated moderate, peaceful change and democratic reform as being what Islam calls for in terms of politics. Now, Ghannouchi in Tunisia had a choice to make similar to what the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt had to make. Did they want to thrust into the face of the Tunisian people a really religious constitution, which declares Sharia to be the principal source of law, or did they have to accommodate the secularists? Ghannouchi accommodated the secularists, even though he was in power. So the Tunisian constitution refrains from making any mention of Sharia, and as a result, we've seen a rather peaceful transition in the Tunisian government.
So I think we have time for one more.
Hi. I was wondering, this goes back to the first part of the lecture when you were talking about the two verses, the verse of the sword and the verse of the poll tax is the second one, I believe.
Right.
And you mentioned that those two are heavily outweighed by the 144 verses in favor of peace. But I was just wondering, when you were reading the translations in the second one, in the first one the word kill appeared, and in the second one the word fight appeared. And I was wondering in the original Arabic, as in English, the word fight does not necessitate physical violence, it just means to struggle against something, like the word jihad.
Right.
And I was wondering whether in Arabic that original word, either exclusively or inclusively, includes a definition of physical violence.
Right. In both cases, the term is qital, the root is qatala, which implies physical force or physical violence. So it's not jihad. The verses do not use jihad here. Now, what the Muslim jurists did, and the commentators on this verse, is to conflate jihad with qital. And it's not a complete conflation, it's not a one-to-one mapping, but an important part of jihad becomes qital, or physical, force or violence. Combat, in other words. So in these two cases, there's no real room for ambiguity. It's, use force against them. But again, as I argued, you need to go to the context, and tragically, that was what was missing. I was talking with this gentleman in the back during the break. Muslim commentators did not ever develop during the classical period a sense of the Quranic message as a whole.
When was the classical period?
Thank you for asking. I would date it from the 9th century, the rise of the Abbasid Empire. So, late 8th, early 9th century, the movement of the Islamic center of culture and power to Baghdad, and ends with the sacking of Baghdad in 1258. So we go from the early 800s to the year 1258 was a dramatic watershed. The Mongols didn't leave anything standing. And that sent, in many ways, Islamic culture, especially in the central, what's called the heartland, into a tailspin. And in many ways, it never recovered. It never recovered. So that's the classical period. And in this classical period, we had multiple interpretations of the Quran, numerous commentaries being published. But no one thought it worthwhile to develop a complete Quranic approach to war and peace, let's say, or a complete Quranic ethics. I don't know why. It wasn't part of their intellectual agenda. So what they have done, what they have bequeathed to us is verse-by-verse commentary. They themselves do not contextualize the verses. So it's not as if these are enemies of Islam that are doing this. Now, what is happening today among modern Muslims is there's an attempt to undo that legacy and to come up with an entire, holistic approach to Quranic ethics, especially on the topic of jihad.
I think we have 2 more hands. Maybe we can hear from each of you, and then Miriam is going to give us a few takeaways from the evening, and we'll conclude.
Should we take them together?
That's what I was suggesting. Yep.
Well, my own thinking has been moving, as you talk. But first, I was going to ask a question that came up here at the end, which was about what would be a just war response to ISIS now, and to what extent do you feel that Obama's suggestion and what's happening now does feel within that framework?
Yes.
So I'll leave it at that.
Okay. And if we could just have the...
I can speak loudly.
You can speak loudly. Good.
I was at the Big E today. Early I came directly from there. And my daughter was with me and she wears a hijab. So in Better Living Center, 3 women come up to her. She was attending to her baby and said to her, "Are you a Muslim?" And I was there. She said, "Yes." She said, "Then I would move out of here because this is America." So what we are hearing is that the biggest problem in the world are Muslims or Muslim terrorist groups. To put things in proper perspective, I would ask our respected guest speaker to tell us, or if you take all of the groups together, how many people have they killed collectively? Compare that to how much Bashar al-Assad has killed, how much Milosevic killed, how many Stalin killed, and how many have been killed in Iraq since our invasion, how many have been killed in Afghanistan, and put it in perspective. In other words, this ISIS, how many people have they killed, or ISIL? And we have 3 years of Bashar al-Assad massacring more than 200,000 people, and we don't feel the urge to do anything about it. And the same story goes on in Kashmir. The same has been a 60-year struggle for the Palestinians, and yet it's not something on the table, not even something to be considered. More Palestinians were killed in Gaza in 3 weeks than ISIL has killed in its whole existence. If I'm wrong, please correct me. And maybe you can have some comments on this, that we should put all this in proper perspective of what's going on in the world.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing that.
Well, thank you to both. Those are very, I think, important questions and intervention. In spite of the, international relations, I teach ethics and international relations, and I'm always asked, isn't that an oxymoron? And in many ways, I often feel they're really, is no consistent application of morality to world politics. States act on the basis of their interests. Pure and simple. The realists are called the realists because they have their finger on some very important insight into the behavior of peoples and states. So we haven't gone to war against Bashar al-Assad because Bashar al-Assad has been very careful not to do anything to antagonize the United States of America. We came very close. If you had asked me in August, late August of last year, is the United States going to attack Bashar al-Assad, I would have said yes, he's crossed the red line. And I, like many, many observers of Middle East politics, we were absolutely astounded that the President of the United States would send his Secretary of State out and give a just war-based defense for an action against the Syrian regime, and then at the very last minute back down and send the matter to Congress to debate. That was really, from our point of view, that was just mind-boggling. I think it was a low point for the Obama presidency. But the response of the Bashar al-Assad regime shows that they were taking a possible American intervention seriously. And in some ways, the situation was resolved in a way that I think was beneficial to everyone involved, because who knows what an American intervention in Syria would entail. It will be a long and very costly, drawn-out war. And certainly, very few Americans have the stomach for an all-out invasion of Syria as we did in Iraq. Now, going to your question, I believe that ISIL needs to be dealt with. I don't think this problem can be allowed just to continue with the hope that it will go away. They will alienate the people that they're trying to appeal to, and therefore their foundation will be weakened. But they could rule for a few years based on pure intimidation and just violence. So I, at this point, support the President's call for a concerted international effort. Again, I believe fundamentally it should be spearheaded by the Arab states themselves, who certainly, we would think, have the military capability to take the initiative. And I think we will see more of, especially the Kurdish forces being involved in this action. But the close air support that they need, I think, is where the American military can play a positive role. So I am cautiously supportive. I would not, the invasion of Iraq in many ways was was a godsend to these extremist groups. And so we have to really avoid getting drawn into a situation where these groups will feed off of the allegation that the United States of America is an imperialist power bent on dominating this part of the world, which will give it the ammunition it needs to, it'll provide the oxygen it needs to really expand and thrive. So at this point, I'm supportive of the President because I think he's getting good advice, quite honestly. I really was impressed by the thoughtfulness of General Dempsey's assessment of the situation, that ISIL does not pose a direct threat to the United States homeland, and therefore we can avoid sending ground troops there to deal with it. So let me stop there.
So, thank you, Miriam, for drawing this together.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming, and a big thanks to our speaker, Professor Fatih Biswal. Thank you very much, Professor, for sharing with us your time and your wisdom and your insights. So to draw this whole event together, I'm going to present you with my 3 takeaways, and I hope that they resonate with some of you. So number 1, these terms, jihad, holy war, just war, they're all very different, and they're not necessarily synonymous with one another. Number 2, jihad has many meanings. It's multifarious in its meanings, and while it may be popularly understood as a holy war, it's important to remember what Professor Hashmi alluded to, which is that the primary meaning of the term is that of struggle, of striving, a personal struggle, and putting your best effort into something. And then finally, number 3, this is something that we've been talking about throughout the evening, which is the importance of context and perspective, especially when dealing with these very complex and very complicated terms. So when you're reading an article about jihad or about ISIS or about these global events that are happening right now as we speak, or when you're watching TV or when you're just discussing them with friends or with colleagues, think about the context, think about the historical and the religious and political context behind them, so that we can all have more nuanced and discussions about them. So thank you very much.
And I just wanted to make a quick announcement about the subsequent events included in our Bridging Muslim Non-Muslim Divide series. The next event is on October 21st at 7 p.m. It's a showing of the documentary film by PBS, Wham Bam Islam, and it follows a Kuwaiti psychologist who wants to create positive role models for his children, and so begins to develop a comic book featuring the 99 attributes of Allah personified, and the struggles they do to make the world a better place. And so it follows him as he struggles to do this. And this is October 21st at 7 p.m. Bring a friend. It's in this very room. So I hope to see you here again. And then the following event is our conclusion of our 2004 activities. It's going to be at the Kittredge Center in Hoyle Community College. But it is, you have to register for that one. So registration is not yet open. And it's a meeting of public sector officials who are all going to meet and discuss ways to make our communities more inclusive and build understanding between Muslims and non-Muslims in our communities. So registration is not yet open for those. But please check back on our website, and if there's space, I encourage you to enroll, and I hope to see you there as well. Again, thank you, and again, thank you to Professor Hashmi, and I hope you all have a wonderful night. Thank you for coming.